George had stopped believing in himself long before he stopped touching his tools. At first, it happened slowly. One missed evening became three. Three became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became months. The small workshop behind his house turned into a room full of silence. Every morning before work, George walked past it with his coffee in hand. The old wooden door stood there quietly, almost waiting for him. Sometimes he paused for a second, staring at the handle. "Tonight," he whispered to himself. But night always came with excuses. Too tired, too late, too stressed. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow never came. Inside that workshop were pieces of the man George once wanted to become. A saw his father gave him when he was 19. Boxes filled with screws and nails carefully sorted years ago. Half-finished projects covered in dust. A bookshelf leaning against the wall like a forgotten promise. George worked at a small office downtown. The job paid enough. People called him responsible. Quiet, reliable. But inside, he carried a strange heaviness, because deep down he knew he was living far away from the person he wanted to be. His father had been different. His father built things, not quickly, not perfectly, but patiently. George remembered being 10 years old and watching his father shape a single chair leg for almost an hour. "Why are you taking so long?" young George once asked. His father smiled without looking up. "Because wood remembers every mistake." Back then, George didn't understand. Now at 32, he understood too well. Life also remembered every unfinished thing. One cold Saturday morning, George noticed his neighbor William working outside. William was old now. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook slightly when he lifted heavy wood. Yet every morning, there he was, working on a wooden bench in his driveway. George watched him through the kitchen window. 20 minutes, that was all. William sanded a few pieces carefully, cleaned his tools, covered the bench with cloth, and went back inside. The next day, he did the same, and the next. Finally, George walked over holding his coffee. "You're building that very slowly," George said. William laughed softly. "When you get older, slow becomes normal." George looked at the unfinished bench. "When will it finally be done?" William shrugged. "It'll be done when it's done." "That doesn't bother you?" "No." "Why not?" William wiped sawdust from his hands before answering. "Because every morning I wake up knowing I still have something meaningful to return to." That sentence stayed in George's mind all day. That night after work, George stood outside his workshop for a long time. The air was cold. The old door creaked as he pushed it open. The smell hit him instantly. Wood dust, oil, old memories. For a moment, he just stood there quietly. Then his eyes landed on the unfinished bookshelf. He walked over slowly and picked up a piece of sandpaper. 5 minutes. That was all he did. One small corner, then he left. The next night he came back. 3 minutes. The night after that, maybe 7. He stopped making big promises, stopped planning giant schedules, stopped waiting to feel motivated. He simply returned. Again and again. Some nights he barely touched the wood. Some nights he only measured pieces without cutting anything. One evening he walked into the workshop, stared around for 30 seconds, and walked back out. But the next day he returned again. For the first time in years, George stopped thinking about becoming successful overnight. Instead, he learned something smaller, something quieter. Progress survives on repetition, not intensity. Weeks passed. Slowly, the bookshelf changed shape. The rough wood became smooth. The shelves started fitting together. The room no longer looked abandoned. Then life became difficult. Again, his office demanded overtime. Deadlines piled up. His manager grew impatient. George came home exhausted every night. The workshop lights stayed off. 1 week passed, then 2. The old guilt returned immediately. "See," he thought, "you always quit." One evening, he saw William outside again. Still working, still slowly building the same bench. George walked over. "You're still doing 20 minutes?" William smiled. "Some days less." I stopped again. "So?" George frowned. "So, I failed." William shook his head. "No, you only fail when you decide not to return." George stood there silently. William looked directly at him. Starting and stopping is normal. Life interrupts everybody. The important thing is learning how to come back without hating yourself. That night, George reopened the workshop, not with excitement, not with motivation, just quietly. He picked up the sandpaper and worked for 3 minutes. The next day, he came back again. Autumn arrived slowly. The air became cooler. Leaves gathered along the sidewalks. And one Thursday evening, George placed the final shelf into position. The bookshelf was finished. It wasn't perfect. One side leaned slightly. The stain looked uneven in places. A corner wasn't completely straight, but it stood there. Real, finished, built by him. George carried it carefully into his living room. Then he walked to the old cardboard box in the corner and removed his father's carpentry book. He placed it gently on the top shelf. For several minutes, he simply stood there, staring at it. He expected fireworks, pride, a dramatic feeling of transformation. Instead, he felt something much calmer, steady. For the first time in years, he trusted himself a little. Not because he had become extraordinary, but because he had learned the skill most people never master. Coming back. That night, George opened a notebook and drew a small wooden table. Simple design, 4 legs, flat top, nothing special. He looked at the drawing and smiled quietly. Tomorrow he would begin. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. It didn't matter anymore, because now he understood something his father and William had known all along. Great things are not built in giant moments of motivation. They are built in small returns, repeated over and over again.